The signal had been playing for 4,000 years. It was weak now, barely a whisper in the vast emptiness of space, repeating the same desperate call for help over and over again. It had been sent out by a civilization that once stood tall, a species that had believed in hope, in unity, in the promise that somewhere among the stars, someone was listening. But as the centuries passed, that hope had faded into myth. No one had come. No one had answered. The distress call became nothing more than an echo of the dead, lost in the black void of time. Until today, the space above Vorth Prime, the dying homeworld of the Zel'thari, had been quiet for centuries. The remnants of their once great people had been driven underground, hiding in the ruins of cities that had long since turned to dust. The sky, once filled with mighty fleets, was now empty, ruled by the silence of defeat. And then the silence broke. A tremor rippled through the command center buried deep beneath the planet's surface. Elder Vorrak, the last surviving leader of the Zel'thari High Council, turned his weary gaze to the holoscreen in front of him. His golden eyes, dulled by age and loss, widened in disbelief as a reading flickered to life. An incoming signal, a presence in orbit where there had been nothing before. The ancient distress beacon, once ignored by the galaxy, had finally been answered. Above the planet, the stars twisted. A tear in space unraveled, folding open like a wound in reality itself. And from that wound, they emerged. Massive ships, dark and smooth, glided into view, their surfaces reflecting the faint light of the dying sun. They moved with unnatural precision, engines humming with a power that the Zel'thari had never seen before. These were not Vorrak ships. This was not another invasion. This was something else entirely. A voice, steady and commanding, cut through the static. It spoke in a language that had not been heard on this world before, but somehow, through the translators, it was understood perfectly. "We heard your call. We are here." Vorrak felt his breath catch in his throat. He had spent his life waiting for this moment. His father had waited. His grandfather. Thousands of generations had prayed for someone to come, but no one had believed it would ever happen. And now, when the Zel'thari were at their weakest, their lowest, the impossible had become real. In the great chamber beneath the surface, murmurs spread like wildfire. The survivors, the last remnants of a species on the brink, stared at the transmission in shock. Their ancestors had once told stories of mighty warriors among the stars, of legends who had disappeared long ago. The humans. But those were just myths. Weren't they? The holoscreen crackled, and a face appeared, a man. He had short-cropped dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and a look of calm authority that sent a chill through the room. His uniform was unfamiliar, his insignia unreadable. But the way he stood, the way he looked straight through the screen, left no doubt. This was a warrior. "This is Captain Elias Carter of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. We received your distress signal. We have come to assist." No one spoke. No one breathed. For a long time, Vorrak had feared that the Zel'thari would be the last of their kind to ever walk this planet. He had feared that the Vorrak had already won, that their people had been abandoned, that their history would end in nothing but dust and forgotten ruins. But now, as he stood before the image of a living human, those fears began to crack. Yet, deep inside, a new fear took root. Why now? Why had they waited so long? And most importantly, what kind of force had they awakened after 4,000 years of silence? The chamber was silent. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The image of the human captain flickered on the holoscreen, his piercing gaze scanning the council chamber like he could see right through the walls, right through the weight of history pressing down on the broken people before him. Elder Vorrak's hands trembled. He could still hear the echo of the human's voice in his ears. "We have come to assist." The words felt unreal. A part of him wondered if this was a dream, a hallucination brought on by years of despair. But no. The unreadable symbols on the human's uniform, the hum of his ship's engines in orbit above their world, the unreadable depth in his cold blue eyes. This was real. A younger warrior, Lurva, barely past his first century of life, stepped forward. His voice wavered, unsteady, as he spoke. You are human." The question was barely above a whisper, as if saying it too loudly would cause the image to disappear. Captain Carter tilted his head slightly, like he was expecting the question. "Yes," he said simply. Lurva turned to the elders, to the others standing around him. "Humans," he repeated, as if he was still trying to convince himself. "The lost warriors of the stars. The species that vanished." The air in the chamber grew thick. Every Zel'thari in the room had heard the stories, old tales passed down through generations, whispers of a species that once roamed the void, a species that had fought monsters and conquered the unknown. But that was thousands of years ago. No one had seen them. No one had heard from them. Some believed they had perished in wars beyond the reaches of known space. Others believed they had never existed at all. Vorrak steadied his breathing, forcing himself to regain control. This was no time for myths or legends. He stepped forward, his voice heavy with caution. "You say you have come to assist." His golden eyes narrowed. "Why now? Why did you not come before?" Captain Carter's expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes, something unreadable. "That is a long story, Elder Vorrak." The elder did not look away. "Then tell it." For a moment, Carter was silent, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he spoke. "We received the signal 4,000 years ago," he said. "We heard it." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Lurva clenched his fists. "Then why did you leave us to die?" Carter didn't flinch. He met Lurva's glare with a steady, unwavering gaze. "We never left," he said. "We were watching." The room froze. Watching. The thought sent a chill through Vorrak's bones, watching as their cities burned, watching as the Vorrak crushed their people, enslaved them, starved them, drove them underground like rats. He could feel the weight of anger rising around him, in the younger warriors, in the broken voices of those who had waited too long for hope. "You let us suffer." Lurva's voice was low now, controlled, but dangerous. "We waited until we were ready," Carter said. The weight of those words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Ready. Ready for what? Vorrak wanted to demand answers, but before he could speak, a new sound broke the moment. A warning klaxon. The holoscreen flickered, and a new image appeared. A live feed from the orbital scanners. The Zel'thari council chamber fell into chaos as a fleet of ships broke out of the shadows beyond the dying sun. Not human ships. Not allies. The Vorrak had arrived. It was impossible. They had been quiet for so long. They had already crushed the last of the resistance. They had enslaved those who remained. What reason did they have to return? Unless they had seen the same thing the Zel'thari had. The humans. Vorrak's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. The Vorrak had never truly abandoned their watch. They had been waiting, just like the humans, waiting to see if the Zel'thari would rise again. And now, at the first sign of change, they had returned to snuff it out before it could begin. Lurva's voice was sharp. "They know." Of course they knew. The Vorrak knew something had changed. They had ruled this planet for thousands of years, and they would not allow the tides to turn. Vorrak turned back to the screen, his voice urgent. "Captain Carter, you say you came to assist." Carter nodded. "We did." "Then tell me, human." Vorrak's voice was grave. "Do you fight?" For the first time, Captain Carter's lips curled into a small smile. It was not a smile of amusement, not of arrogance. It was something else, something far more dangerous. "We didn't come all this way to talk." And then, in the skies above Vorth Prime, the human fleet moved. The Vorrak fleet descended like a swarm of hungry beasts, their jagged warships slicing through the darkness of space with practiced precision. The crimson glow of their engines reflected against the upper layers of the atmosphere, painting the night sky with an eerie red hue that sent shivers down the spines of those watching from below. The Zel'thari had seen this before, the arrival of their oppressors, the herald of suffering. But something was different this time. This time, the Vorrak were not alone in the skies above Vorth Prime. The humans moved. Captain Carter stood aboard the TSS Resolute, his arms folded as he watched the Vorrak ships breach the planet's outer defense grid. Their movements were sharp, coordinated, like a pack of predators who had done this 1,000 times before. He had seen fleets like this before. Conquerors, tyrants, oppressors who had never been given a reason to fear. That was about to change. Status report. His voice was calm, controlled. Around him, the bridge crew worked with military precision, fingers gliding over holographic controls as data scrolled across their displays. Vorrak fleet consists of 16 warships, 5 capital carriers, and 1 command dreadnought, said Lieutenant Avery, her voice sharp and professional. Their weapons are online, and they're scanning our ships. No hails. They're moving to engage. Carter exhaled slowly. The Vorrak were predictable. They had spent too long ruling over species who couldn't fight back. To them, the sight of new ships in orbit didn't register as a threat, just another obstacle to be crushed. They don't know what they're dealing with, he muttered, stepping forward. On the surface of Vorth Prime, inside the Zel'thari's hidden command bunker, Elder Vorkel and his people stared at the unfolding battle above. They had never seen human warships before. Their hulls gleamed under the light of the dying sun, their forms sleek and predatory, designed not for intimidation, but for war. Lurva's heart pounded as he watched the Vorrak fleet approach. He had seen this exact scenario before, had watched Vorrak ships descend and rain destruction upon what was left of his people. He had always believed that no force could stop them. But as he turned his gaze toward the human fleet, a strange sensation stirred in his chest. Something different was about to happen. The Vorrak opened fire first. Bolts of plasma energy lanced across the void, streaking toward the human fleet with deadly precision. In past battles, these first strikes would have torn through weak planetary defenses, turning the skies into a graveyard of shattered metal and burning debris. But this time, the shots never landed. Human shields flared to life, absorbing the impacts like water against steel. The Vorrak hesitated. This was not normal. They had expected explosions, chaos, the usual dance of overwhelming firepower crushing another helpless enemy. Instead, the human fleet remained untouched. And then they returned fire. The Resolute led the charge, its forward cannons roaring to life, unleashing an onslaught of kinetic railgun rounds that sliced through the lead Vorrak warship. The impact was instant and devastating. The Vorrak vessel, designed for domination, not defense, buckled under the sheer force. A single barrage, and its hull cracked open like fragile glass. Before the Vorrak could react, the rest of the human fleet moved in perfect synchronization. They didn't just fire blindly like desperate defenders. They targeted weak points, flanked the larger warships, used maneuvering tactics that the Vorrak had never encountered before. The Vorrak fleet wasn't fighting an enemy trying to survive. They were fighting an enemy that had come to destroy them. On the surface, Lurva could hardly believe what he was seeing. He had witnessed countless battles against the Vorrak, had watched his people be slaughtered mercilessly time and time again. But this was different. This was a hunt. He turned to Vorkel, his voice trembling. Elder, the humans, they are not just here to help us. His breath was shaky, eyes wide as another Vorrak warship exploded in the sky above. They are here to end them. Inside the command dreadnought of the Vorrak fleet, Supreme Commander Khazor watched the battle unfold with something he had never felt before. Confusion. The Vorrak had ruled over the Zel'thari for generations, had crushed every attempt at resistance without so much as a challenge. But now, in the span of mere minutes, his warships, his fleet, were being ripped apart. His second-in-command, A towering Vorrak officer covered in thick obsidian armor turned to him. "Supreme Commander, the humans, they are not what we thought." Khazor bared his fangs, his claws tightening into a fist. "Then we make them fear us." His massive clawed hand slammed down on the command panel, activating a fleet-wide transmission. His voice, deep and guttural, resonated across every Vorrak warship. "All vessels, regroup. Focus all firepower on their lead ship. Destroy the humans before they..." Before he could finish, the Resolute launched its next strike. A single torpedo, sleek and unassuming, shot through the darkness of space, and then everything turned white. The explosion was silent in the vacuum of space, but its effect was deafening. The shockwaves spread out in all directions, rippling through the enemy fleet. The Vorrak dreadnought lurched violently, its shields collapsing in an instant as the weapon's energy pulse disrupted every system on board. On the surface, the Zel'thari shielded their eyes from the sudden burst of light, but Lyrava forced himself to watch. He needed to see this. When the light faded, when the sensors adjusted, the Vorrak dreadnought, the indestructible beast that had ruled their skies for centuries, was drifting helplessly, its armor shattered, its power systems failing. The Vorrak fleet had never experienced this before. Defeat. Supreme Commander Khazor's voice was a snarl of disbelief as his screen flickered with emergency warnings. Impossible. And then the human transmission cut through his command channel. Captain Carter's voice, calm and merciless, filled the Vorrak dreadnought. "You should have never come." The Vorrak warlord stared at the screen, at the image of the human captain. He had never feared any species before. But now, for the first time in his long, blood-stained life, he was afraid. The Vorrak dreadnought drifted like a wounded beast in the black sea of space. Fires raged across its shattered hull, flickering against the void as desperate repair crews scrambled to contain the damage. Its once mighty presence, a symbol of Vorrak dominance, was now a graveyard of broken metal and flickering morning lights. The rest of the Vorrak fleet, seeing their flagship in ruins, hesitated. They had never hesitated before. Supreme Commander Khazor's claws dug into the metal of his command chair, his breathing heavy with barely restrained rage. He had led hundreds of conquests. He had crushed resistance on a dozen worlds. He had never faced an enemy like this, one that did not just fight, but dismantled him, piece by piece, with chilling precision. "Status report." His voice thundered through the command bridge. His officers scrambled, frantically trying to make sense of what had happened. Human technology was not supposed to be this advanced. The Vorrak had ruled for centuries, fought countless wars, subjugated weaker species. But this was not war. This was extermination. "They have disabled our primary weapons," Supreme Commander, one of his lieutenants, reported. "Our shields are failing. We need to retreat and regroup." Retreat. Khazor's eyes flashed red in fury. "You think we run from these creatures?" "They are more than we anticipated," the officer admitted, fear creeping into his tone. "If we do not fall back, we risk." A new voice cut through the transmission. "Risk what?" The Vorrak bridge fell silent. The voice wasn't one of theirs. It had overridden their internal comms, a breach that should have been impossible. The screen in front of Khazor flickered and changed, revealing Captain Elias Carter's face, calm, unreadable, and utterly fearless. Khazor felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Humans shouldn't be able to do this. You think you're the only ones who can take over a battlefield." Carter's voice was almost amused, but underneath it was something darker, something lethal. "You've spent centuries crushing weaker species, wiping out civilizations, thinking you were untouchable. You never stopped to wonder if someone was watching." Khazor's fangs bared. How? How had they infiltrated his command systems? How had they crippled his dreadnought so easily? "Your fleet is crippled," Carter continued. "You have one chance. Surrender, or we finish this." The words sent an explosion of rage through Khazor's chest. He slammed his fist onto the command console. Never. The Vorrak never surrendered. They had ruled the stars with blood and fire, and they would do the same today. He cut the transmission. All ships, regroup and fire at will. I want their lid vessel obliterated. The surviving Vorrak warships surged forward, abandoning their defensive formation. This was no longer a battle. This was desperation. They concentrated all firepower on the Resolute, pouring every ounce of energy they had left into one final, all-consuming strike. But the humans had been waiting for this. Carter stood firm on the bridge of the Resolute, watching the incoming attack with the cold patience of a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. And the Vorrak had made the worst mistake possible. He glanced at his weapons officer. Fire. The human fleet moved as one, their counterstrike perfectly timed. Guided railguns, pulse cannons, and EMP torpedoes shot forth with unrelenting precision. Every single Vorrak ship that had rushed forward was caught mid-charge, their shields stripped away in an instant. On the surface of Vorth Prime, Lyrva and the Zel'thari watched in stunned silence. They had never seen anything like this. The Vorrak had been unstoppable for generations, an empire of terror that crushed all in its path. And yet, before their eyes, their fleet was being systematically dismantled, reduced to nothing but burning wreckage in the sky. The Vorrak dreadnought, still crippled from the earlier attack, attempted to withdraw. Engines sputtering, its massive bulk struggled to turn, to flee into the depths of space. Carter would not allow it. His voice was quiet when he gave the final order. End it. The Resolute's forward railguns charge. The energy built up with a deep hum, the deck vibrating under the raw power being unleashed. And then, they fired. The blast tore through the Vorrak dreadnought, cutting through its reinforced hull like a blade through flesh. The massive warship shuddered, the impact splitting its core, rupturing its reactors. Explosions cascaded along its surface, turning its mighty form into a funeral pyre in the void. On the bridge, Khazor's expression twisted in shock, his claws tightening on the failing controls. How? How had this happened? How had his fleet, the Vorrak Empire's pride, been so utterly annihilated? As flames consumed the bridge, as the final alarms blared, he realized the truth. They had never stood a chance. The humans had always been beyond them. They had just never bothered to strike. Until now. And then, in a final explosion of fire and metal, the Vorrak dreadnought was gone. Silence returned to the battlefield. The surviving Vorrak ships, crippled and leaderless, turned and fled. For the first time in thousands of years, the Vorrak were running. On the surface of Vorth Prime, the Zel'thari stood frozen. None of them spoke. None of them could. They had fought for survival for so long that they had forgotten what victory felt like. Lyrva slowly turned to Vorkel, his voice barely above a whisper. It's over. Vorkel stared at the burning wreckage falling from the sky, at the human fleet still hovering in formation, waiting. His voice was heavy, shaking with disbelief. No, he said, it's just beginning. Above them, aboard the Resolute, Carter exhaled as the last Vorrak signals disappeared from the sensors. He turned to his communications officer. Open a channel to the Zel'thari leadership. The holo transmission flickered to life, showing Elder Vorkel's weathered face. The old Zel'thari leader's eyes were filled with something Carter recognized all too well, the weight of a species that had been on the edge of extinction for too long. Carter's voice was steady. You're free now. Vorkel didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the destruction above, at the remnants of a war that had defined his people's fate for generations. And then, with a slow breath, he bowed his head. We were never free, he said. Not truly. Not until today. Lyrva stepped forward. His voice held no fear anymore, only something new, something powerful. What happens now? Carter's eyes darkened. The Vorrak Empire had just suffered a blow that would shake the foundations of their rule. They would regroup. They would retaliate. This wasn't over. His answer was simple. Now we prepare for war. The embers of the Vorrak fleet still burned in the skies above Vorth Prime, casting flickering light over the surface of the planet. The battle had ended, but the echoes of war still clung to the air, thick and suffocating. For the first time in millennia, the Vorrak were not the ones standing victorious over the ruins of another civilization. They had lost. They had fled. They had tasted fear. Inside the underground command chamber of the Zel'thari resistance, silence lingered as every eye remained locked on the screen. The humans had not left. Their fleet hovered above, unmoving, watching. Lurks stood beside Elder Vorrak, his chest still heaving from the adrenaline that had not yet faded. His hands trembled at his sides, though not from fear. For the first time in his life, he felt something else, something unfamiliar. Power. The Vorrak retreated, he murmured, as if saying it aloud would make it feel real. They ran. Vorrak's golden eyes were unreadable as he stared at the transmission screen, at the human captain who had just rewritten history. Yes, he said, but they will return. Above, aboard the TSS Resolute, Captain Elias Carter stood in the war room, a three-dimensional projection of the Vorrak Empire flickering before him. The battle had been decisive, but it had not been an ending. It was only the first strike. The Vorrak had lost today, but they would not accept this defeat in silence. He turned as the holo-transmission from the Zel'thari leaders stabilized. Vorrak's weathered face appeared, his expression as heavy as the weight of his people's past. "You were right," the elder admitted. "You did not come here to help. You came here to end them." Carter did not deny it. "The Vorrak have ruled through fear for centuries," he said. "They believe themselves untouchable. That illusion is gone now." His blue eyes sharpened, but they won't stop. Their empire is too vast, their hunger too deep. Today, they lost a battle. They won't allow themselves to lose a war. Vorrak exhaled slowly. He had known this truth before Carter had even spoken it. The Vorrak were not like the Zel'thari, clinging to the edges of survival. They would not hide. They would retaliate with fury. Lurks, his fists clenched at his sides, took a step forward. "Then we take the fight to them," he said. The fire in his voice startled the others in the chamber. "We don't wait for them to return. We strike first." The words hung in the air. They were words that no Zel'thari had spoken in thousands of years. Vorrak's gaze flickered to the young warrior. He had seen this before. The spark of rebellion, the whisper of something greater. For generations, the Zel'thari had been bound in chains of fear. But now, standing in the aftermath of this battle, something had changed. For the first time, they were looking at their enemy not as conquerors, but as prey. "You speak of war," the elder said carefully. "But do we even have the means to fight it?" Carter leaned forward, the lights from the holographic map casting sharp shadows across his face. "You don't," he said. "Not yet. But we do." Vorrak's brow furrowed. "Then why are you here?" His voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of centuries of suffering. "Why now? You said you've been watching, that you've heard our signal for 4,000 years. So why wait until today?" Carter's eyes darkened. The truth was complicated, but he would not lie. "Because we needed to know if you were ready." Silence followed. Vorrak's fingers curled against the metal surface of the war table. His voice came out hollow, almost bitter. "And what did you see? Were we ready as we suffered beneath Vorrak rule? As they hunted us, enslaved us, broke us? Was it necessary for us to be brought to the very edge of extinction before you decided we were worthy of your help?" The weight of his words pressed down on the room. Carter did not flinch. "No," he said. "It wasn't about worth. It was about survival." His gaze flickered toward the map of the Vorrak Empire, glowing with the markers of millions of worlds under their control. "If we had moved too early, they would have crushed us before we had the strength to stand. We waited because we had to, because the Vorrak are not the true enemy." That made the room still. Lurva's voice was sharp. "What do you mean?" Carter exhaled, his expression unreadable. Then, with a simple motion, he expanded the holographic projection. The Vorrak Empire was large, colossal, stretching across the stars in an endless network of enslaved worlds and conquered civilizations. But then Carter adjusted the display, zooming outward, pulling back further and further and further. The Vorrak Empire was not the only force in the galaxy. Beyond their borders, on the farthest edge of the known universe, a dark void stretched across the display. A void with no name, no records, nothing but silence. And yet, within that silence, something moved. Carter's voice was low. "The Vorrak were never the true rulers of this galaxy," he said. "They thought they were, but the only reason they've been allowed to rise, to spread, to conquer, is because something else has been waiting in the dark." The holo display flickered, showing distorted readings. Data that should not exist. Star systems erased from records, entire planets vanishing without a trace. Lurva's breath caught in his throat. "What is this?" Carter's jaw tightened. "The reason humans left the galaxy." Vorkel stared at the void on the map, a creeping sense of dread curling around his chest. For 4,000 years, the Zel'thari had believed that the Vorrak were their ultimate enemy. They had thought of them as the greatest evil in the universe. But now, as he looked at the dark unknown beyond the Vorrak's borders, he realized something. The Vorrak were running from something too. Carter's voice cut through the silence. "We fought them once, a long time ago." His blue eyes met Vorkel's. "We lost." The room was deathly still. Lurva swallowed hard. "Then why come back?" Carter's expression was grim. "Because they're coming." The weight of his words settled over them like a tomb. The Vorrak were dangerous, but they were nothing compared to what lay beyond the void. The Vorrak had spent centuries conquering, preparing, expanding, but they had never crossed the line. They had never dared to venture beyond the silent edge of the universe, because even they were afraid of what was waiting there. And now, that darkness had begun to stir once more. Carter leaned forward, voice quiet, final. "The Vorrak are only the beginning," he said. "You want war. You want revenge." His gaze swept across the stunned faces of the Zel'thari. "Then you'll need to become more than survivors. You'll need to become warriors. Because the Vorrak are nothing compared to what's coming next." Lurva's heart pounded. "What? What is coming?" Carter's reply was cold. "The end of everything." The stars above Vorth Prime no longer felt the same. They had once been a cage, a vast, inescapable abyss where the Zel'thari had been abandoned to suffer. Now, they felt heavier, their silence threatening rather than empty. The Vorrak had fled, but in their absence, something far worse loomed just beyond the edge of the known galaxy. Lurva stared at the holographic projection in front of him, his throat dry. The void beyond Vorrak space, the nameless darkness that Carter had revealed, was unlike anything he had ever seen. The Vorrak Empire was massive, stretching over thousands of worlds. But beyond them, nothing. Entire systems wiped clean, planets simply erased from existence. No wreckage, no remnants, just absence. Elder Vorkel stood beside him, his expression unreadable, golden eyes reflecting the flickering glow of the human's war map. For the first time in his long life, he felt something deeper than fear. Insignificance. The Vorrak had been their world, their greatest enemy, their nightmare. But what if they had been fighting the wrong war all along? Captain Elias Carter sat across the war table, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the map. The moment the Vorrak retreated, he had expected their next move. They would return, of course, but only if they had the luxury to. What lay beyond the Vorrak's borders had not given them that luxury in the past. Lurva finally found his voice, though it was quieter than he would have liked. "You're saying the Vorrak aren't the true enemy?" Carter nodded. "No, they're just the last ones left standing." The word sent a shiver through the room. Lurva clenched his fists. "But the Vorrak are monsters. We've lived under their boot for generations. We watched them slaughter our people, break our spirits, erase our history. Are you telling me there's something worse than them?" Carter met his gaze. Yes. The bluntness of it was a cold knife to the ribs. Lurva turned toward Vorkel, his voice growing desperate. "We finally have a chance to take back what was stolen from us, to destroy them before they return. We should be celebrating their defeat, not worrying about ghosts in the dark." Vorkel was silent. Carter leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "The Vorrak are nothing more than a symptom. You think they built their empire by accident? That they were the first to rise like this? No." He gestured toward the flickering void at the edge of the map. "Something older than them left this galaxy emptied. The Vorrak have been running ever since." Lurva shook his head. "Then why don't they talk about it? Why do they pretend to be the apex of the universe?" "Because fear is control," Carter said. "They rule with an iron grip because they know what happens when order collapses. They saw it happen once, maybe to themselves, maybe to something else." His eyes darkened. "But one thing is certain. They never cross that line." Lurva turned back to the map, staring at the vast emptiness where planets should have been. He wanted to believe Carter was wrong. He wanted to believe the Vorrak were the end of the war, not just the beginning. But deep inside, something gnawed at his instincts. The Vorrak never acted without purpose. If they were so powerful, so dominant, why had they never expanded beyond their own borders? Why had they stayed within the same reach of stars for thousands of years? Because they were afraid of what lay beyond. Vorkel finally spoke, his voice steady despite the weight of the conversation. "If you are right, Captain Carter, then why did humanity return? You left the galaxy once. If you knew what was out there, why not stay away?" Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned, pressing a command into the war table. A new projection flickered into existence. Not Vorrak, not Zel'thari. It was a human colony. Or rather, what was left of one. The image sent a ripple of shock through the chamber. The city, if it had ever been one, was nothing but scorched ruins, twisted metal, and collapsed towers. Unlike Vorrak invasions, there were no bodies, no debris from an enemy fleet, just silence. "This was the outermost Terran colony," Carter said. "It went dark 5 years ago." He let the words settle. "We sent fleets. We searched for survivors." He exhaled, eyes cold. "We found nothing." Lurva's mouth felt dry. "The Vorrak." Carter shook his head. "They don't operate like this. If they took a world, they'd leave something behind. Wreckage, corpses, slave camps." He gestured at the emptiness before them. "This isn't them. This is something else. Something that doesn't just conquer. It erases." A deep unease settled in Lurva's stomach. The Vorrak were slavers, conquerors, destroyers. But they weren't erasers. Vorkel's voice was quiet. "You believe it's coming here." Carter's jaw tightened. "I don't believe it." He looked at the old Zel'thari leader. "I know it." Lurva looked back at the holomap, at the ever-growing void creeping toward them, devouring system after system. His mind raced, trying to understand what this meant. They had just won their first battle. They had just seen the Vorrak run. And now, it was already being eclipsed by something worse. Carter's voice was grim. "This is why we never answered your distress call before. Because we weren't ready. Because we needed to make sure that when we stepped back into this galaxy, we weren't alone." His blue eyes locked onto Vorkel's. "That's why I'm here." Vorkel slowly nodded. "You want an alliance." "I want a war," Carter corrected. "And I need you to survive it." Silence settled over the chamber. The weight of the moment pressed into every Zel'thari in the room. They had been fighting for their freedom, for their future, for their revenge. But now, the stakes had shifted. This was no longer just about the Vorrak. This was about everything. Lurva's fingers curled into fists. And if we refuse? Carter didn't flinch. Then the Vorrak return. They enslave you again. Maybe you fight back. Maybe you win. He turned back to the holomap, where the darkness loomed beyond Vorrak space. And then, when you think you've won, when you think you've secured your future, the real enemy arrives. His gaze swept across the room. And by then, it'll be too late. The room was still. No one spoke, because deep inside, they already knew the truth. The Vorrak were not the greatest threat. They were just the first wall to break, and whatever was coming would not stop at the Vorrak. It would not stop at the Zel'thari. It would not stop at humanity. Lurva closed his eyes, breathing in the weight of the decision before them. There was no turning back. "We fight," he said. Vorrak looked at him for a long moment, then slowly turned to Carter. "So be it," he said. Carter nodded. The war had just begun. The night skies over Vorth Prime had once been a reminder of oppression, of the endless cycle of war and defeat that had plagued the Zel'thari for thousands of years. But now, those same skies had become something entirely different. The Vorrak were gone, driven back into the void. Humanity had returned, revealing truths darker than the Zel'thari could have imagined. And in the wake of the battle, something deeper settled over the planet. Not relief, not victory. A reckoning. Lurva stood at the edge of a balcony within the underground city, staring up at the shattered remnants of Vorrak warships still burning in orbit. The smell of ash, plasma, and blood still clung to the air. Even though the enemy had retreated, it still didn't feel real. The Vorrak did not retreat. They conquered. They destroyed. They crushed. And yet, for the first time, they had run. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. He turned to see Elder Vorrak, his gaze as heavy as the weight of their people's history. The old leader had lived through the worst of the Vorrak occupation. He had seen the horrors firsthand. But even he had never imagined this moment. "Do you feel it?" Vorrak asked, his voice quiet. Lurva exhaled. "I don't know what I feel." Vorrak nodded slowly, his golden eyes drifting to the sky. "It is difficult to accept," he admitted. "After so many centuries of suffering, after watching generation after generation crumble beneath the Vorrak's rule, to see them fall so easily." His voice faltered for a moment before regaining its strength. "I do not know whether to celebrate or to fear what comes next." Lurva knew what he meant. This war had never been about winning. No Zel'thari had ever even considered such a thing. Their entire purpose for thousands of years had been to survive. The thought of actually fighting back, of taking the war to their oppressors, of ending them, it was too big, too impossible. And yet here they were. Before Lurva could respond, a transmission alert echoed through the city. Every holoscreen, every communications device, flickered to life. The human fleet was calling. Lurva and Vorrak exchanged a glance before stepping into the war chamber, where a crowd of Zel'thari had already gathered. The massive holoscreen displayed Captain Elias Carter, standing aboard the TSS Resolute, his expression as unreadable as ever. "You have your world back," Carter said, his voice calm but firm. "But the war isn't over." Silence settled over the chamber. The weight of the words hit everyone at once. Carter continued, "We've intercepted Vorrak transmissions. Their fleet is regrouping. Their empire is shifting. Your resistance changed the course of history today, but history doesn't end with one battle." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes steely, unyielding. "The Vorrak have two options now: reclaim what they lost, or collapse entirely." Lurva clenched his fists. "Then we strike before they do." Carter studied him. "You're thinking like a soldier now." The words sent a strange sensation through Lurva's chest. A week ago, he had been just another survivor. Just another nameless soul trying to outlast the Vorrak's cruelty. Now he was standing in a war chamber, discussing an invasion. Vorrak stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We understand what you are offering," he said carefully, "but we do not yet understand why." Carter met his gaze. "Because this isn't just about the Vorrak." The holomap flickered to life again, and once more, the room stared into the abyss. The void. The darkness beyond the Vorrak's empire, where entire star systems had vanished without a trace. It wasn't just empty space. It was a wound in the galaxy, a silence that devoured everything. Carter's voice was steady. The Vorrak ruled because they were afraid of what was coming. And they should be. He let the weight of his words settle. They ran. But running isn't going to save them. It isn't going to save anyone. Vorkel exhaled slowly. He looked at the void, really looked at it, and for the first time in his life, he understood. The Vorrak were not the final enemy. They were the last obstacle standing in the way of something much worse. The Zel'thari had believed they were alone in their suffering, that the Vorrak were their ultimate nightmare. But they weren't alone. And the Vorrak were just another species trying to survive. Lurva took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "What happens now?" Carter's response was simple. "Now we make a choice." The room fell silent. "The Vorrak will return," Carter said. "And when they do, they'll come with everything they have. But if we break them, if we push beyond their borders, then we don't just win a war." His gaze swept across the chamber. "We prepare for what's coming next." Vorkel exhaled deeply. The final war had not yet begun. But if they waited, if they let the Vorrak recover, if they let fear hold them back for even a moment longer, it would be too late. The Vorrak had ruled through fear. They had crushed species, built an empire on the broken bones of lesser civilizations. But they were not invincible. And they were not the gods of this galaxy. They were the last of the old empires, the final dynasty before the storm. Vorkel turned to the gathered Zel'thari warriors, their faces alight with something he had never seen before. Not just hope. Purpose. He looked back at Carter and gave a single nod. "We fight." Carter nodded in return. "Then let's finish this." The screen flickered out, and the chamber erupted into motion. The Zel'thari, once slaves, once survivors, were now soldiers of a war that would decide the fate of the galaxy. Lurva exhaled, looking up at the human ships still waiting above their world. The Vorrak had ruled for thousands of years. But now, their time was ending. The last war of the old galaxy was about to begin. And beyond it, the true war awaited.